The morning in Tudor England did not arrive with silence. It crept upon the land with the cries of roosters, the barking of dogs, the creak of cartwheels over rutted lanes, the voices of men and women calling across smoky courtyards. Dawn broke. Slowly, but life was already awake. For survival did not wait for sunlight. In the countryside, the mist lay low upon fields of rye and barley. Dew clung to the grass, silver beads trembling before the rising sun. Thatched cottages crouched close. Together, sent ribbons of smoke from their chimneys, though the smoke often lingered inside before finding the hole in the roof. Children stirred upon straw pallets, brushing away fleas as they rose, while mothers stoked dying embers, blowing them back to life to boil porridge of oats and barley. Inside such homes, the air was thick with smoke, dampness, and the musk of animals. For beasts and humans shared space. A cow tethered near the hearth, chickens scratching at rushes strewn across the dirt floor, a pig snuffling in a corner. The floor was hard-packed earth, scattered with herbs to cover the stench, but the smell of dung, sweat, and mold lingered. No pane of glass softened the morning light. Wooden shutters opened to the chill, and a gust carried the mingled odors of mud and refuse from the lane outside. Men rose early, pulling rough woolen tunics over weary limbs, binding leather belts about their waists. Women tied kerchiefs over their hair, donned coarse linen gowns, and fastened aprons stiff with the stains of labor. Children, barefoot, tumbled into daylight. Some carrying buckets to fetch water from the well, others herding geese or gathering firewood. No child lingered in idleness. Even the smallest pair of hands was pressed into service. The village lane was narrow, churned to mud by rain and dung. Geese hissed at passers-by, pigs rooted among heaps of waste, and dogs snarled over scraps. A woman emptied a chamber pot into the gutter, the foul water joining the sluggish stream that ran through the center of the street. The smell was acrid, pungent, yet familiar. No nose flinched, for it was the scent of life itself. Beyond the cottages lay the fields. Men bent low with sickles, cutting stalks heavy with dew, their breaths clouding in the morning air. Others drove oxen, yoked to wooden plows, the beasts' hooves sinking deep into the mire, their breaths steaming in the cold, when gleaned fallen. Ears of grain, filling baskets against hunger that was never far. The fields were endless, the labor ceaseless, the reward meager, yet the rhythm of toil was as steady as the turning of seasons. In towns, the morning stirred differently. The streets of London, though broader than village lanes, were no less foul. Wooden houses leaned over narrow alleys, their upper stories jutting like crooked teeth above the press of people below. Merchants opened shutters, displaying baskets of onions, wheels of cheese, salted fish glistening in the weak light. Bakers drew loaves from ovens, the crusts blackened, the scent of bread mingling with the stink of refuse in tanneries. Apprentices hurried through the streets, carrying tools for masters. Carters urged horses forward, wheels splashing filth onto passers-by. Beggars crouched at corners, their hands outstretched, their voices hoarse with pleas. The clamor of bells from churches marked the hour, calling men and women to labor and prayer alike. The river carried its own symphony. On the Thames, barges groaned under the weight of timber, grain, and coal. Watermen called out, their oars biting into murky waters, while ferrymen cursed as they jostled for passage. Fishmongers dumped their catch upon wet boards, the smell of eels and herring wafting across the docks. The river was lifeblood and sewer both, its waters bearing trade and waste in equal measure. For the wealthy, morning brought a gentler stir. In manor houses, servants rose before dawn to stoke fires, polish silver, and lay out garments for lords and ladies. Kitchens bustled with preparations, eggs beaten with herbs, venison stewed in iron pots, loaves sliced and arranged upon pewter, plates in chambers hung with tapestries. Nobles stretched upon feather beds, their bodies perfumed, their hair combed by attendants. Yet even here, comfort was shadowed by fear of sickness, of intrigue, of royal displeasure. The court itself was a world apart. In palaces, gilded with banners, courtiers donned silks and velvets, collars stiff with lace, shoes of soft leather. Pages hurried with messages, guards stamped in formation, heralds announced the rising of kings. The air was heavy with ambition. Whispers of alliances and betrayals, rumors of who had fallen from favor and who had risen overnight. For in Tudor England, fortune was a wheel that turned swiftly, and those who stood at its summit could tumble to the scaffold with but a breath. And yet whether in hut or palace, all men and women of Tudor England shared the same rising sun. They breathed the same smoke, walked the same muddy streets, endured the same hunger and fear of death. The difference lay only in degree, not in kind. For the poor died quickly, the rich more slowly, but death claimed all. Morning was but the beginning of struggle. They stretched long ahead, filled with toil, sickness, judgment, and fleeting joys. And in every breath of dawn one truth lingered. Survival was no certainty. Life in Tudor England was not measured in wealth or luxury, but in the small, fragile triumph of surviving another day. The hours stretched long, filled with toil and hunger, punctuated by moments of rest that were never enough. From the first bite of coarse bread at dawn to the weary silence of night, each breath was a negotiation with hardship. Food was the beginning and the end of every thought. For the poor, meals were neither plentiful nor varied. The table bore only what the land and labor could provide. Bread formed the foundation, but it was heavy, dark, and sour, baked from rye, barley, or oats. White bread, soft and fine, was the pride of the wealthy, but for the commoner it was a dream tasted only on feast days, if at all. Pottage was the constant fare, a thick stew of grains, peas, beans, and whatever scraps might be found, dunions pulled from gardens, leeks grown in muddy soil, wild herbs gathered by children in the fields. Meat was rare, salted pork or dried fish stretched thin to flavor the pot. Fresh meat was a treasure, eaten at Christmas or Easter or when a bird could be caught in traps. Ale was drunk by all, thick and cloudy, for water itself was unsafe, its wells fouled by waste. Even children sipped ale, their lips stained with bitterness before they learned to speak. Asterisk in wealthier houses, the fare differed. Tables groaned with roasted venison, pie stuffed with eels, capons basted in butter, sweetmeats glistening with honey. Spices from the east, cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron perfumed the air, their cost measured in fortunes. Nobles dined upon silver, drank from goblets of pewter or glass, wiped their hands upon embroidered cloths. But even their banquets were not safe from rot, for food spoiled quickly. The smell of decay lingered beneath perfumes. Hunger united high and low, though its sharpest edge was felt by the poor. A bad harvest could bring famine, and famine brought death. Children with swollen bellies cried in vain, mothers stared with hollow eyes, men grew gaunt as fields failed. The memory of past hungers haunted villages, spectre that returned whenever rains drowned, crops or frosts cut early. The houses of Tudor England mirrored their lives, fragile, rough, and bare. In villages, cottages crouched low, their walls woven of wattle and daub, their roofs of thatch thick with vermin. Rain leaked through, smoke clung to rafters, and winter's cold seeped into every crack. The hearth was the heart of the home, its fire both warmth and breath. But smoke often filled the air, stinging eyes, blackening beams, settling into lungs. Furniture was meager, a table of rough boards, stools worn smooth, chests for clothing. Beds were pallets of straw, sometimes shared with animals. In towns, houses rose narrow and tall, upper stories jutting above the street, their timbers dark with age. Yet within, conditions differed little. Dirt floors, smoky rooms, dampness that bred coughs and fevers. Clothing was both armor and burden. The poor wore wool, coarse and heavy, dyed in dull browns and grays. Tunics and gowns were patched and repatched, handed down through generations, stiff with grime. Feet went bare in summer, hardened by earth, blistered by stones. In winter, Shoes of stiff leather offered little protection against mud and frost. Women wore long gowns with aprons, their heads covered by kerchiefs. Men bound belts at their waists, their sleeves rolled for work, their garments never quite dry. For the wealthy, clothing proclaimed rank. Velvet and silk shimmered, furs lined cloaks, lace collars rose like fans. Colors of scarlet and purple were marks of privilege, forbidden to commoners by law, yet finery brought discomfort of its own stiff. Heavy, cumbersome, worn more for display than ease. Fashion was cage as much as glory. Labor filled every hour. Fields, men swung sickles, sowed seed, drove oxen, bent their backs until spines ached. Women spun wool, brewed ale, baked bread, tended gardens, gathered herbs, washed linens in streams. That stank of waste. Work was endless, for idleness meant hunger, and hunger meant death. Children carried burdens before their limbs were strong, drove geese, fetched water, gathered wood, or laughter swallowed by duty. Even the noble were bound by labor, though theirs was of a different kind. Lords oversaw estates, counted rents, managed tenants, ladies embroidered, kept accounts of household stores, supervised servants. Leisure existed, but it was gilded labor. Performed beneath the gaze of expectation and courtly intrigue, the burden upon women was doubled. They bore not only work, but life itself. Childbirth was perilous, shadowed by fever and bleeding. Many did not survive, leaving husbands widowed, children orphaned. Yet life pressed on, for another mouth must be fed, another back bent to toil. Children were blessings and burdens both. They grew swiftly into workers, their hands quick upon looms, their legs swift in fields. Yet death claimed many before they reached 10. Fevers, flux, hunger, plagal stalked the young. Mothers wept, but tears were as common as rain. So the day passed, not with ease, but with endurance. Meals swallowed hastily, clothes damp with labor, laughter rare but not absent. For even in hardship, joy found cracks to grow. Children chased geese through lanes, men sang in fields, women gossiped by wells. Humanity endured, stubborn as weeds in broken soil. And as the sun climbed high, and the day unfolded into toil, the truth of Tudor life stood plain. It was not a world for comfort. It was a world where survival itself was triumph, where each hour lived was victory against hunger, sickness, fate. Sickness was the shadow that clung to every breath in Tudor England. It crept through lanes and fields, settled in cottages and palaces alike, and whispered that no life was safe, no body secure. Death was not an intruder. It was a companion, seated at every hearth, walking every road, waiting at every bedside. The air itself was suspect. Mists from marshes were thought to carry poison, foul vapors rising from swamps to creep into lungs. Men called it miasma, the corruption of the air, unseen yet deadly. Physicians walked with pomanders, balls of herbs and spices held to their noses to ward off invisible corruption. But herbs did little against the fury of plague, fever, or flux. The plague was the terror above all. Buboes swelled in armpits, and groins blackened and burst. Fever raged, delirium seized the mind, and within days the body was cold. The tolling of church bells marked its passage, ringing not for one but for many, until bells themselves seemed weary with sorrow. Villages emptied, streets grew silent, carts creaked beneath the weight of corpses dragged to pits. Children clutched their mothers only to die in their arms. Priests whispered last rites until their voices failed. Yet plague was not the only specter. Sweating sickness swept through England in waves, sudden and merciless. A man healthy at dawn might be in his grave by dusk. It struck with fever and chills, then sweat poured from the body, drenching garments, soaking beds. Breathing grew labored, the heart pounded, and death came swiftly, leaving no time for farewells. None knew its cause, none its cure. Fear itself became contagion, spreading faster than the sickness it shadowed. Smallpox scarred faces, blinding some, killing others. Consumption wasted lungs, coughing blood upon linens, until the body withered to bone. Typhus crept through lice, dysentery through water, pax through touch. Each season brought its own affliction, each household its own grief. And beneath it all, the daily misery of filth gnawed at life. Cleanliness was rare. Baths were distrusted, thought to weaken the body, to open pores to sickness. Men and women washed their hands and faces, but whole bodies were cleansed but a few times in a year. Dirt clung to skin, grease to hair, fleas to garments. Houses were not havens, but traps. Smoke filled low rooms, stinging eyes settling into lungs. Rushes strewn upon floors grew foul with droppings, food scraps and vermin, only rarely changed. Windows without glass admitted cold, and flies in equal measure. In towns, alleys served as sewers, chamber pots emptied into gutters, wastes mingling with mud and rain. The stench was thick, yet noses grew used to it, for there was no other air to breathe. The Thames itself was both lifeblood and death. Its waters carried fish and trade, yet also offal and refuse. Tanneries dumped skins, butchers poured blood, privies spilled filth. Those who drank from its flow swallowed sickness unknowing. Ale was safer, thick, and bitter, but ale could not quench thirst forever. Infant death was the heaviest sorrow. Cradles stood often empty, mothers' arms bereft. Half of all children born never reached adulthood. Mothers prayed at every birth. Candles flickering at altars, yet many bled and fevered in childbed, leaving both mother and babe for burial. The churchyards were crowded with the small mounds of the young, silent testimonies to the frailty of life. Physicians offered little solace. Learned in Latin, draped in robes, they prescribed bloodletting, purges, charms, and powders. They balanced humor's blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile seeking harmony through leeches and herbs. Yet more often than not, their cures hastened death rather than hindered it. The poor had no physicians at all, relying instead on wise women with bundles of herbs, whose knowledge was part wisdom, part superstition. Superstition ruled where knowledge failed. Charms were hung above doors, amulets tied to children's wrists, prayers muttered over steaming cups of possets. Some wore toad bones or carried dried flowers as protection. Others sought saints' relics, dipping cloths into holy water, pressing them to fevers. Faith and fear mingled, for when death circled daily, men grasped at any hope. Cemeteries filled with the dead. Graves were shallow, marked with wooden crosses that rotted quickly. In plague years, bodies were piled in pits, earth thrown hastily above them. The air of London was heavy with decay, the sweet sick stench of mortality. Bells tolled, priests muttered prayers until their lips cracked. Gravediggers labored until their arms failed. Yet even in this, life continued. Men plowed fields beside plague pits. Women baked bread while neighbors coughed blood. Children played in lanes where death had walked the night before. For survival demanded indifference, or at least the appearance of it. To stop was to starve. To mourn too long was to invite despair. Nobles fared little better. They dined upon silver, yet sickness did not respect wealth. Henry VIII himself trembled at the sweating sickness, fleeing his palaces at the first rumor. Elizabeth's court was scarred by smallpox. Courtiers lost to fevers, physicians powerless in their silks. Palaces were gilded cages, no safer than cottages. Their tapestries unable to shield against death. Death was familiar, almost intimate. It was spoken of openly, prepared for daily. Children grew up watching bodies carried to churchyards, hearing prayers for the dead, seeing skulls carved upon stones. Life was brief, uncertain, and men lived with that knowledge as constant as breath. And so, the people of Tudor England endured each day with death at their shoulder. Their eyes looked upon life as fragile, fleeting, and filled with sorrow. In that knowledge lay both terror and strength. For though death stalked every lane, still they sowed, still they sang. Still they bore children into a world that promised nothing but toil and tears. To live in Tudor England was not to escape death, but to walk with it, hand in hand, from cradle to grave. And for those who would step from modern streets into that world, even a single day would be unbearable. 4 lungs unaccustomed to smoke, 4 stomachs unready for foul water, 4 bodies untried by ceaseless hunger, death would come swiftly, silently. As it had come for millions before, the laws of Tudor England were written not only in ink, but in blood. Justice was no gentle hand, but a sword that fell with weight and certainty, striking high and low alike, yet more often the poor than the powerful. To live in those times was to walk always beneath the shadow of punishment, where even the smallest crime could summon death. The marketplace itself was a stage for justice. At dawn, when villagers gathered to trade, the stocks stood waiting. Wooden frames with holes for head and hands placed in the center of towns were ready to shame thieves and liars. A man found guilty of stealing bread might be thrust into the stocks, his neck clamped, his hands exposed, while neighbors jeered, pelted him with rotten vegetables, spat upon him. The punishment was public. Humiliation meant to burn deeper than lashes, yet lashes too were common. Whips cracked across backs in courtyards and markets, even upon roadsides. Stripped to the waist, the condemned bent beneath blows that tore flesh, each strike a lesson to those who watched. Blood mingled with dust, and cries echoed through alleys. It was not mercy, but spectacle, for pain was thought the surest teacher. Thieves often faced the gallows. Stolen sheep, a coin pocketed from a noble's purse, a loaf of bread taken in hunger, these could lead a man to the noose. The gallows stood tall on hills outside towns, their silhouette visible against the sky, grim reminders to all who passed. On market days, hangings drew crowds. Children perched upon shoulders, women murmured prayers, men shouted curses. The condemned, a rope about his neck, prayed for mercy as the trap gave way and silence fell upon the crowd. Death was swift, yet the terror lingered. For greater crimes, punishment grew more savage. Treason was the greatest offense, and its penalty was a death designed to unmake the body. Men accused of betraying the crown were dragged through streets upon hurdles, jeered, and spat upon. At the scaffold they were hanged, cut down still alive, their bellies opened, entrails drawn, hearts held high before the crowd. Their bodies were quartered, their limbs sent to towns as warnings. It was justice as horror, meant not merely to kill, but to terrify. Women accused of treason were spared this butchery, yet not spared death. They were burned, flames rising about their skirts, smoke filling the sky. Neighbors watched with silent fear, for fire consumed not only flesh but hope itself. To be a traitor was to vanish utterly, body and memory alike consumed. Even lesser crimes bore cruelty. Vagabonds, men and women, without masters or homes, were whipped through towns. Branded upon cheeks, forced into servitude, begging was crime, idleness was sin. To wander without purpose was to invite the lash, for poverty itself was suspect. The prisons of Tudor England were no refuge but pits of despair. Tower of London held nobles and traitors, its stone walls echoing with chains, its dungeons dark and damp. But for the common, jails were foul holes, airless and crowded, filled with stench of urine and rot. Prisoners paid for straw to lie upon, paid for food, paid even to remove irons. Those without coins starved in darkness, forgotten until death freed them. Torture, though less common than in other lands, still whispered in chambers of stone. The rack stretched bodies until joints burst. Thumbscrews crushed bone, iron boots shattered shins. The scavenger's daughter folded men until ribs cracked. Confessions were dragged from screams, truth tangled with pain, though kings claimed. It was rare the cries of tortured men echoed behind the doors of palaces. The law was no shield of fairness. It bent toward the powerful who paid fines where the poor were hanged. Nobles were beheaded, granted the mercy of the axe. Commoners swung from ropes or burned. Women accused of witchcraft were stripped, pricked with pins, drowned in rivers, or burned upon pyres. Their cries joined the wind, another lesson in fear. Yet justice was not only cruelty, it was theater. Hangings were festivals of death. Vendors sold pies, ale flowed, songs rose. Crowds gathered not in sorrow, but in curiosity, their eyes eager. For spectacle, children watched with wide eyes, learning early the cost of defiance. The gallows was a teacher, cruel but constant, reminding all that law was not mercy, but mastery. Still, beneath the cruelty lay fear, fear of disorder, fear of rebellion, fear of chaos. The crown was brittle, and kings knew it. Keats' punishment was meant to hold the realm together, to bind subjects with terror. For in a world where plague and famine stalked, the law sought to be more dreadful still. And so, a single day in Tudor England was shadowed by justice, sharp as steel. To stumble was to fall, to hunger was to risk crime, to speak carelessly was to invite suspicion. To live was to walk carefully, eyes lowered, lips guarded, hands steady. For the law waited at every corner, its gallows tall, its fire hungry, its justice merciless. Faith was the rhythm of Tudor life, steady as bells tolling across misty fields. It guided breath and thought alike, weaving through hours of work and moments of rest, commanding obedience with both comfort and terror. In those days, one could not step far without feeling the weight of the church, for its shadow lay over village lanes, city streets, and the gilded halls of kings. Morning began with prayer. In cottages, mothers murmured the Pater Noster while stirring pots of porridge. In manors, chaplains intoned psalms while candles flickered against walls hung with tapestries. Bells rang from parish towers, calling all within earshot to kneel bow and remember eternity before the day had even begun. Faith was not a choice. It was breath, unavoidable, as necessary as bread. The parish church was the heart of every village. Its stone walls rose above thatched roofs, its steeple pointing heavenward like a finger of warning. Within, the air smelled of incense and damp stone. Wooden pews creaked beneath weary bodies, and light streamed through narrow windows, casting colors upon worn faces. Priests stood before altars heavy with brass candlesticks, their voices chanting in Latin words few understood. Yet the ritual mattered more than the meaning. For in kneeling, bowing, crossing oneself, men and women felt bound to something beyond hunger and toil. Religion was comfort, but also command. To live in Tudor England was to live watched not only by overseers and sheriffs, but by God himself, whose gaze was said to pierce all secrets. Sin was everywhere, in idle words, in glances, in thoughts unspoken. Confession was demanded, penance given fasting, prayer, pilgrimage. Forgiveness came not through choice, but through ritual, and, even then, fear lingered. The calendar itself was a holy chain. Feasts and fasts divided the year, saints' days marked by processions. Lent by hunger, Easter by rejoicing, Christmas by candlelight and ale, even markets bent to the rhythm of holy days, when labor ceased and bells called all to kneel. Now work. And faith were one, toil offered as devotion. Survival itself framed as obedience, yet religion was also power, sharpened by politics. The Reformation tore England's soul, breaking it upon altars. Once, all bowed before Rome, kissing relics, whispering prayers to saints. But Henry VIII broke from the Pope, crowned himself head of the church, and seized monasteries. Lands changed. Hands' wealth was stripped, monks cast into streets. Old faith clashed with new, and men who prayed wrongly risked death. For in Tudor England, faith was not merely private, was loyalty to crown. To follow Rome was treason. To deny the king's supremacy was heresy, and both crimes bore the same end: fire, rope, or axe. The martyrs' cries rose with the smoke of pyres, their blood-staining cobblestones. Protestants and Catholics alike burned, each in turn branded traitors. Truth mattered less than allegiance. Survival demanded obedience to shifting tides. Fear of hell burned deeper still. Priests painted visions of torment, flames unending. Demons with iron claws, rivers of fire where sinners screamed without rest. Children trembled as sermons thundered, women wept, men crossed themselves in dread. Heaven was bright but distant. A hope gilded in gold, but hell was near, waiting just beyond sin. To live in Tudor England was to live daily with eternity pressing heavy upon the soul, yet faith brought solace too. Hymns rose in small choirs, voices rough yet earnest, filling cold stone with warmth. Candles lit at shrines flickered hope into darkness. Pilgrims trudged muddy roads toward holy wells, drinking in belief that healing might come. Mothers taught children prayers, fathers traced crosses upon brows before work. These small acts bound lives together, fragile threads against despair. Superstition mingled with scripture. Amulets hung in cottages, herbs tied above doors, charms whispered against fevers. The Virgin's image stood beside carved runes, saints invoked alongside pagan spirits. Belief was a tapestry, woven of old and new, faith and fear alike. Was rare to deny unthinkable. In every shadow lurked devils, in every blessing the hand of God. The crown itself bent beneath religion's weight. Kings and queens wielded faith as weapon and shield, declaring wars in God's name, condemning foes as heretics, rewarding loyalty with sanctity. Yet even monarchs trembled at pestilence, at comets in the sky, at rumors of divine wrath. Thrones toppled beneath accusations of impiety. Faith was both crown and executioner. Children grew in this world of prayer and fear. They learned catechisms before they could read, recited commandments before they could count. Their imaginations filled with angels and devils, saints and demons. Dreams were haunted by visions of heaven's light and hell's fire. Innocence was shaped early into piety, for to falter was to risk damnation eternal. The poor, who owned nothing else, clung to faith as treasure. Though their bellies were empty, their souls were rich with prayers. A wooden rosary was wealth, a scrap of saint's bone was fortune, a candle-lit at altar was hope. They could not buy bread, but they could purchase indulgence, a promise of mercy after death. And so they gave, even from hunger, offering pennies to priests while their children cried. Even laughter bent to faith. Festivals began with mass, maypoles, with blessings, marriages with vows before God. Death itself was but another ritual. Badillas carried to churchyards, bells tolling, prayers whispered. Life was a passage between sacraments, baptism, marriage, burial, each framed by priestly hands, each binding men to heaven and crown alike. And so, religion ruled Tudor England, not as distant doctrine, but as daily breath. It was solace, terror, promise, and threat, comfort and chain. To live there was to kneel often, to cross oneself daily, to fear sin hourly. It was to believe that the body was frail, the world corrupt, and only obedience could guard the soul. For one unaccustomed to such a world, a single day would break the spirit. To wake to bells, to hear sermons of hellfire, to see pyres rising in town squares, to feel eyes watching thoughts unseen, this weight would crush even the strongest. Heart, for Tudor England, was a kingdom not only of men, but of God's shadow, vast and inescapable, amidst toil and sorrow. The people of Tudor England still sought moments of escape, for even in a world shadowed by hunger and death, laughter found a place to grow. Entertainment was no luxury of kings alone. It was a breath seized by peasants and nobles alike, a brief reprieve from the grind of survival. Yet the amusements of that age bore little softness. They were raw, boisterous, and often cruel, reflecting a world where hardship hardened the heart, and villages, festivals, lit the year. May Day brought garlands of flowers, ribbons bright against drab garments, poles raised high as villagers danced in circles, their feet stirring dust into the air. Fiddles scraped, flutes trilled, drums beat rhythms ancient as the soil itself. Children wove through the crowd, clutching sugared treats or roasted chestnuts, their laughter ringing above the music. Fairs bustled with color and noise. Merchants spread cloth upon rough tables, displaying knives, trinkets, pots of pewter, bolts of wool dyed crimson or green. Jugglers tossed knives before wide-eyed crowds. Tumblers bent their bodies into impossible shapes. Fire eaters breathed flame into the sky. Storytellers spun tales of knights and saints, their voices rising and falling in cadence that pulled even the weary into wonder. Ale flowed freely, mugs clinked, songs roared as the day waned, music filled lanes and halls. Alike, lute soft and intricate, plucked out melodies that drifted through manor chambers, where nobles reclined upon cushions. The hurdy-gurdy droned in village squares, its steady hum joined by pipes and drums. Ballads told of kings betrayed, of maidens wronged, of battles lost and won. Voices rose in chorus, cracked yet earnest, binding listeners in shared song. Dancing was the heart of merriment. In cottages, couples stamped upon earthen floors, skirts swirling, boots pounding in rhythm with fiddles. In courts, dances were ordered, steps precise, partners bowing and turning with measured grace. The pavan, stately and slow, the galliard, lively and leaping, each spoke of station, of elegance, of order amidst chaos. Yet whether in cottage or palace, dance carried the same joy, bodies moving, breath quickened, laughter shared. But Tudor entertainment was not all gentle. The crowd hungered for spectacle, and spectacle often meant blood. Bear baiting drew throngs to pits, where great beasts were chained, their teeth bared, their roars shaking the earth. Dogs were loosed upon them, snapping and tearing the crowd, roaring as fur and blood flew. Men wagered coin, shouted insults, laughed as animals suffered. To the people, it was not cruelty, but sport, as ordinary as music. Cockfighting carried the same savage delight. Roosters, sharp-spurred, were set upon each other, feathers flying, beaks tearing flesh. Bets were laid, purses exchanged, cheers rose with each strike. Children pressed close, learning early the thrill of violence. The ring of bloodied feathers was a schoolyard as much as an arena. Public executions. It's a blurred line between justice and entertainment. When the gallows claimed its victim, crowds gathered as if to fair. Vendors sold pies, ale was drunk, jokes were told as men awaited the drop of the rope. Heads upon spikes above city gates became landmarks, gazed at with grim curiosity. Death itself became spectacle, woven into the tapestry of Marand. In London, the theatre rose as a new wonder. Wooden playhouses stood tall, their open roofs welcoming sun and rain alike. Crowds pressed within, the rich seated above, the poor thronging the pit, standing shoulder to shoulder. Upon the stage, actors strutted and declaimed, their words carrying the passions of men and gods alike. Shakespeare himself was yet a man among men, his quill scratching by candlelight, his lines thundered by voices that echoed across timbered walls. Tragedies drew tears, comedies laughter, history's pride. A penny bought standing room, enough for a poor man to share in the same wonder as nobles above. Up to that space. For an hour, all were united, peasants and lords, merchants and beggars, laughing at the same jest, gasping at the same betrayal. The stage was more than diversion. It was mirror. Kings and queens saw their glories reflected, common men their sorrows given voice. Words of love, ambition, treachery, despair, all spilled upon boards, all claimed by listeners as their own. For in theatre Tudor England saw itself clothed not in wool or velvet, but in truth. Taverns, too, were theatres, though of a rougher kind. Dark, smoky, filled with the smell of ale and sweat, they rang with dice rattling, fists slamming, voices shouting in mirth and anger. Minstrels sang bawdy songs, dancers twirled, mugs spilled, quarrels broke, knives flashed, men staggered into night with laughter or wounds. Yet for many, taverns were refuge, a place where toil was forgotten, if only for a mug's length of time. Games were played upon tables, cards painted with kings and queens, dice carved of bone, boards marked for checkers and tables. Wagers were laid, fortunes of pennies risked, curses muttered as luck turned cruel. Children played simpler games, chasing hoops, tossing bones, singing rhymes. Even in poverty, play found a place, a defiance against sorrow. Festivals of the church became festivals of the people. At Christmas, fires blazed, carols rose, Ale flowed in streams. May Day crowned the year with garlands, young men and women weaving ribbons in dance. Harvest brought feasts, oxen roasted upon spits, mugs raised, in thanks to God and earth alike. Life was harsh, yet in these moments, joy burst forth like flowers through stone. And so Tudor entertainment was a mirror of Tudor life, rich and poor, gentle and cruel, lofty and base. Music softened sorrow, theater reflected truth, festivals bound communities, but blood sports revealed the hard edge of hearts steeled by hunger and death. To live, then, was to laugh at cruelty as easily as at jest, to drink merriment alongside suffering, to find joy even in shadows. For one, unaccustomed to such a world, these pastimes would be bewildering. To cheer as a bear tore dogs, to feast beside the scaffold, to sing hymns by day and Bodhi songs by night, such contradictions would confound. Yet for Tudor men and women, this was life, a mingling of beauty and brutality, laughter and blood. Faith and folly, asterisk entertainment was not escape. From the world's harshness, it was its reflection, a reminder that joy was fragile, laughter fleeting, and life itself a performance upon a stage where death was always waiting in the wings. Tudor England was not a single world, but many bound together beneath the same crown, yet divided by walls of wealth, blood, and fortune. Its people breathed the same damp air, walked the same muddy roads, bent knees before the same altars, and yet their lives were worlds apart. The measure of a man's life was not in his breath but in his birth. At the summit stood the nobility, their lives swathed in velvet and guarded by privilege. Lords and ladies dwelled in manors of stone, their halls hung with tapestries, their tables laden with silver. They wore garments of silk, dyed in colors forbidden to common men, scarlet and deep purple shimmering in candlelight. Gold rings glimmered. Upon their fingers pearls adorned their collars. Jewels caught fire in the light of hearths. Their days were marked by ceremony. Courtiers rose to attend the monarch, their every gesture weighed, their every word judged. They feasted in great halls where musicians played and servants hurried with platters of venison and swan. They hunted in forests, hawks upon their wrists, hounds coursing through undergrowth. They danced in chambers where minstrels sang of ancient glories. Yet their lives, gilded as they seemed, were perilous still. For fortune at court was a wheel that turned swiftly. A smile from the king could raise a man to power, a frown could cast him to the scaffold. Beneath the nobility stood the gentry, landowners who were neither peasants nor peers. They lived upon their estates, gathering rents from tenants, their wealth measured in fields and flocks. They sought to imitate nobles in dress and manner, their wives stitching lace, their sons taught Latin. They served as justices, sheriffs, members of parliament. Ambition burned in their halls, for they looked upward always, striving for greater place. Yet they looked downward too, guarding fiercely. The gulf that separated them from common laborers, merchants, and craftsmen formed another stratum. Their lives bound to trade and skill. In London, guilds ruled workshops, their banners bright upon feast days. Weavers, smiths, coopers, butchers all had places, rules, and pride. Merchants grew rich upon wool, the treasure of England, shipping fleeces across seas, their coffers swelling with coin. Some built houses rivaling nobles, their daughters married into gentry, their sons sat upon city councils. They were the pulse of towns, their wealth rising as England opened to trade with distant lands. Yet even among them, fortunes shifted quickly. For a storm at sea, a plague in the city, failed venture could reduce wealth to ruin. Below them toiled the yeomen and husbandmen, farmers bound to soil. Their fields were small, their harvests uncertain, their bellies often hungry. Yet they were free, owning their labor, if not much else. They rose before dawn, sowed seed, reaped grain, drove beasts, brewed ale. Their wives spun wool, baked bread, tended children. Their homes were rough, their clothing coarse, their lives hard, but they were not slaves. Their pride lay in their independence, meager though it was, in the knowledge that their toil fed the nation. Far beneath stood the laborers, those who owned neither land nor trade, selling strength by the day. They dug ditches, carried loads, mended roads, served in kitchens. Their wages barely filled bellies, their lives precarious, one illness or accident away from begging. They lodged in huts, slept upon straw, wore garments patched beyond recognition. Children worked beside them, hands blistered, backs bent, learning. Hardship before speech was firm. At the base of all stood the poor beggars who wandered lanes in crowded cities. They crouched at church doors, hands outstretched, voices hoarse with pleas. Some bore wounds or blindness. Others carried babes upon hips, their ribs showing through tattered cloth. Vagabonds roamed roads, their bodies gaunt, their eyes desperate. The law saw them not as victims but as threats. They were whipped, branded, driven out, punished for the crime of poverty itself. And lower still, if such could be said, were the criminals, the condemned, the wretches who filled jails and gibbets. Their bodies swung from gallows, their heads upon spikes above city gates. They were lessons in flesh, reminders that law reached even the lowest. Their fate was spectacle, their misery a warning etched upon sky and stone. The gulf between these worlds was deep. A noble dined upon roasted meats, drank spiced wine, reclined upon cushions, while a peasant gnawed crusts of rye bread, his stomach hollow. A merchant's child learned to write, while a laborer's child carried water from dawn until dusk. A lady stitched silk with golden thread, while a beggar woman searched gutters for scraps. Yet all breathed the same foul air, all feared the same plagues, all bent beneath the same crown. The monarchy itself stood above all. The king or queen was not merely ruler, but embodiment of nation, a figure draped in majesty and fear. Their word was law, their smile, fortune, their frown, death. They walked beneath canopies, their robes heavy with jewels, yet even they were prisoners of fortune. For a dagger in the dark or a whisper in council could end their reign. Thus Tudor's society was a ladder of many rungs, each man and woman clinging where birth had placed them. To climb was rare, to fall was common, and the distance between top and bottom was filled with blood and sweat. For those born to wealth, life was gilded, yet perilous. For those born to poverty, it was bitter and short, for all survival was uncertain, fortune a wheel that turned without mercy. Such was the order of Tudor England, a world divided, bound by crown and church, sustained by toil, haunted by hunger, and shadowed always by death. The dawn of a Tudor day began, not with gentle ease, but with the press of necessity. Darkness still clung to the thatched roofs, mist swirled low across fields, and yet men and women stirred from sleep upon pallets of straw. Roosters crowed, dogs barked, the cries of infants pierced the chill, and the world awoke to labor before the sun had lifted its golden crown in the cottage of a plowman. The hearth was coaxed to life, embers glowing red against the soot-blackened stones. The mother blew gently upon kindling, sparks leaped, and smoke curled into the low rafters. A pot was set upon the fire, filled with water and oats, and soon the scent of thin pottage filled the air. Children rubbed eyes swollen with sleep, scratching at bites of fleas, while their father pulled on a rough woolen tunic, binding a belt about his waist, his boots stiff with yesterday's mud. Breakfast was no feast. Each took a wooden bowl, dipped into the pot, and ate in silence. Bread, heavy and dark, was shared in slices, dipped into the steaming gruel. A mug of ale was passed, even to the younger ones, for water was untrusted, tainted by wells fouled with waste. Hunger was not sated, only dulled, and soon bowls were empty, hands washed with a rag, and the day began. Men strode to the fields, tools upon shoulders, oxen driven from pens. The earth waited, damp with dew, ridged with furrows. Plows cut through soil, sickles swung, seeds scattered from rough hands. The sun rose, its light gilding the sweat upon brows, but there was no pause for beauty. Work was the rhythm, endless. And relentless, the measure of life itself. Women bent to their own tasks. In gardens, they gathered leeks and cabbages, herbs and beans. In kitchens, they kneaded dough, baked loaves, stirred pots over fires that never ceased. They spun wool, wove cloth, stitched garments. Infants were rocked in cradles by older children, their cries muffled by lullabies half sung as mothers worked. To be idle was sin, and idleness invited hunger. Asterisk in towns, the rhythm was harsher still. Apprentices ran through streets, carrying tools for masters. Shopkeepers lifted shutters, displaying wares upon boards, wheels of cheese, salted fish, bolts of wool. Blacksmiths hammered iron, sparks flying, while coopers bent staves into barrels. Carters shouted as horses strained, wheels splashed filth into the air, and beggars huddled by walls, their hands stretched out to passers-by. Bells tolled from church towers, dividing hours not for leisure, but for labor and prayer. At midday, the meal was brief, for fields and shops could not rest. In cottages, pottage was warmed again, bread sliced anew, perhaps with a scrap of pork, if fortune had smiled out. In towns, men ate pies filled with eels or mutton, bought from vendors in the street. Their crusts blackened, their filling greasy. Ale was drunk, mugs clinked, laughter rose, yet it was laughter tinged with weariness, for the day was far from done. Children bore their share of toil. They fetched water from wells, their shoulders bent beneath the weight of buckets. They gathered firewood, scattered grain, 2 chickens, drove geese to pasture. Some worked alongside fathers in fields, carrying smaller tools, their hands blistered, their backs raw. Others assisted mothers at spinning wheels or looms, fingers learning the rhythm of thread long before they could write. Childhood was brief, replaced by duty before innocence had faded. Afternoons stretched heavy, the sun blazing down, sweat-soaking garments. Men labored until muscles trembled. Women bent until spines ached. Children trudged until feet bled. Overseers watched, masters counted, sheriffs patrolled. To falter was to invite punishment. To complain was to risk dismissal. Work was survival. And survival allowed no complaint. Evening brought no ease, only another round of tasks. Beasts were fed, tools stored, bread baked for the morrow, water fetched for night. The hearth glowed, pots simmered, children's voices rose in thin songs. Supper was much like breakfast: bread, pottage, ale. Rarely a fish caught, a fowl trapped, a rabbit stewed with onions. Plates were wooden, knives few, spoons shared. Hunger was dulled, not defeated, and the fire burned low as darkness crept in cottages. Families gathered upon pallets of straw. Children nestled close to parents, beasts tethered nearby for warmth. The air was heavy with smoke, the floor strewn with rushes damp with use. Sleep came fitful, broken by coughs, by cries, by rats scurrying in corners. Dreams were fleeting, often haunted by hunger or fear. In towns, taverns stirred with noise. Men crowded into smoky rooms, mugs of ale foaming, dice rattling upon boards. Minstrels sang, dancers twirled, fists sometimes flew.
Outside lanterns
Flickered upon alleys, where beggars huddled and thieves prowled. The city did not sleep. It murmured and growled until dawn. In palaces life was gilded, yet no less weary. Nobles feasted upon silver platters, their halls bright with torches, music drifting through air heavy with spice. Yet beneath laughter lay unease, for favor was fragile, and a jest, misunderstood, could lead to ruin. Servants hurried in silence, pouring wine, clearing bones, bowing low. When lords retired, they lay upon feather beds. Yet even there sleep was uneasy, haunted by politics and plague. Night fell across Tudor England, the stars cold above, the earth damp below. Fires dwindled, bells tolled Compline, prayers were whispered. Another day ended, another battle with toil and hunger survived. And in every heart lay the same truth, that tomorrow would come swiftly, with the same hunger, the same labor, the same fear. A single day was harsh enough, but for those born to it, days stretched into years, years into lifetimes, each marked by the same rhythm of struggle. For one unaccustomed, even a single day would be unbearable, the weight of labor and want too heavy to endure. In the villages scattered across the damp green of England, far from the splendor of palaces and the echo of courtly halls, there lived men and women whose names no chronicle would record, yet whose breath sustained the kingdom more surely than the decrees of kings. At dawn the ploughman rose, his bones creaking from years bent behind oxen, his hands calloused, his face furrowed by wind and labor. His cottage was small, its roof sagging with thatch, its floor earthen and strewn with rushes that carried the scent of beasts and dampness. His children slept huddled in straw, their cheeks pale with hunger, while his wife stoked the hearth with trembling hands, coaxing thin flame from dying embers. A pot of oats and water simmered, the morning meal that gave neither fullness nor delight, yet offered just enough strength to walk once more into fields waiting beneath the mist. The ploughman walked with his oxen, their breath steaming in the cold, the plough groaning as it cut the soil. He sang softly to himself, an old tune inherited from his father, sung not for joy but to steady the rhythm of labor. The earth clung to his boots, the sky pressed heavy above, and yet he endured. For endurance was the only wealth his life allowed. His children would one day take up his burden, their spines bending as his had bent, their youth consumed by the same furrows. He did not dream of escape. He dreamed only of harvest, of bread enough to keep death at bay. In another cottage, nearer the city, a widow named Agnes sat before her spinning wheel. The hum of its turning filled the smoky room, her fingers raw, her eyes straining in dim light. She spun wool into thread hour upon hour, her labor unending, for 3 hungry mouths waited upon her coin. She remembered once the warmth of her husband beside her, before fever had carried him to the churchyard, his body lowered into earth unmarked by stone. Alone, she sang to herself as she spun songs her mother had taught her. Lullabies and prayers mingled, her voice thin but steady. Her children learned to hum the tunes as they mended by the hearth, their small voices a fragile harmony against the silence of poverty. Each skein she sold bought bread, each coin she earned kept hunger from her door for one more day. Her story was not one of triumph, but of survival, and in that survival lay a quiet defiance against despair. In the alleys of London, an apprentice boy named Thomas rose from a pallet laid in the corner of his master's workshop. The air stank of ash and soot, the forge already glowing red as the master struck iron. Thomas hauled buckets of water, swept cinders, stoked flames until sweat trickled down his back. His hands blistered, his muscles ached, yet he endured, for 7 years of service might one day bring mastery, his own hammer, his own shop, his own name above a door. He dreamed as sparks flew, each one a fragment of the life he sought, but for now he was no more than a shadow in another man's trade, his voice unheard, his back bent beneath orders, in the manner of a lesser noble. A maidservant named Mary scrubbed floors until her knees burned, polished pewter until her fingers split, carried water from wells until her arms trembled. Her masters dined upon trenchers of meat, their laughter echoing through halls, while she ate crusts left behind, crouched upon the edge of firelight. At night she lay upon straw in a loft shared with other maids, their whispers soft in darkness, voices weaving fragments of hope. She thought sometimes of her family in the village she had left, her mother who wept when she departed, her father too poor to keep her. Her life belonged not to herself, but to service, and yet she found brief moments of joy. At Christmas, she sang in the hall, her voice blending with others, her eyes alight with the glow of candles. At fairs she laughed at jesters, her cheeks warm, her heart briefly free. Her story would not outlive her, but her labor sustained households that never spoke her name. In the fields beyond, a boy of 8, called William, drove cattle with a stick, his bare feet hardened against stones, his belly hollow with want. His father lay in a churchyard, his mother bent with toil, and so he bore the work of men before childhood had fled. He whistled to beasts, ran through grass with laughter despite hunger, his joy defiant, fragile, yet bright. At night he ate thin gruel, curled against his mother's side, and dreamed of one day holding plow and ox as his father had done. His life would be brief, his death likely early, yet in his laughter echoed the stubborn will of the young to find light amidst shadows. Upon London Bridge sat a beggar named Robert, his legs twisted from birth, his body gaunt. He clutched a wooden bowl, calling out to passers-by, with a voice cracked by cold. Some tossed pennies, others spat, children mocked, dogs barked, yet he remained. For to beg was to live, and to wander away was to starve. At night he huddled beneath arches, covering himself with rags, his breath misting in darkness. He dreamed not of wealth nor comfort, but of bread, of warmth, of a coin heavy enough to buy both. He was despised, hunted by law, whipped for idleness, yet still he endured. His life was misery, yet his breath was as sacred as any king's. His suffering is real, his humanity undeniable, though denied. These souls, unseen by chronicles, bore the weight of England. They tilled fields, spun wool, hammered iron, scrubbed floors, herded beasts, begged for crumbs. Their names are lost, their faces forgotten, their bones mingled in earth unmarked. Yet their lives were the true foundation of the realm, for without them no harvest would fill granaries. No cloth would clothe merchants, no stone would rise in manors, no coin would ring in coffers. The Tudor world was built not by crowns and councils, but by these millions of nameless. Their stories did not stand alone. They flowed together, weaving a river of endurance, carrying the kingdom upon their current. They were peasants and widows, apprentices and maids, children and beggars, each bearing sorrow, each grasping small joys where they could. And though history forgot their names, the truth of their existence endures. In every furrow cut by plow, in every garment woven, in every nail hammered, in every crumb begged, their lives whispered the same truth. Survival itself was greatness. Endurance itself was glory. The Tudor world has long since fallen into silence. Its kings buried beneath cold stone, its queens immortalized in portraits where jewels gleam, but eyes stare hollow across centuries. The banners that once flew above palaces are tattered, their colors faded into dust, their triumphs remembered only in brittle parchment. Yet though crowns have rusted and thrones crumbled, the breath of Tudor England lingers still. In its scars, in its ruins, in its stories, it was a world both radiant and cruel. In the glow of candlelight upon velvet halls, nobles danced in measured steps, lutes sang in delicate chords, feasts dazzled with meats and spice. Yet outside those halls, in lanes of mud and smoke, the poor gnawed crusts, mothers buried children, beggars shivered beneath bridges. Beauty and brutality lived side by side, inseparable, like threads in the same tapestry. The people rose with the crow of roosters. Bent spines in fields, spun thread by smoky hearths, hammered iron until sparks stung their skin. They prayed in stone churches where incense mingled with damp, their lips whispering Latin words they scarcely understood, their hearts heavy with fear of sin and hell. They laughed at tavern jests, sang ballads in markets, danced at fairs, even as plague crept unseen through streets, even as gallows cast long shadows. Their joy was fragile, their laughter brief, but both were real. Burning like embers against the wind, the law was iron, sharp, and merciless. Stocks stood in markets, whips cracked across flesh, nooses swayed against sky, and fire consumed those branded heretics or traitors. Justice was theater, punishment spectacle, death a lesson carved into memory, and even in fear, life pressed. On children ran in lanes, men sang in fields, women hummed by hearths. Endurance was defiance, survival rebellion. Faith ruled every hour, bells tolled, priests preached, altars glowed, and eternity pressed upon every breath. Heaven gleamed distant, hell loomed near, and men walked carefully between both. Saints were prayed to, relics kissed, charms carried, amulets tied. When the Reformation tore England's soul, prayers shifted, altars broke, blood was spilled in God's name. Yet the people still knelt, still prayed, still hoped. For in a world of hunger and death, faith was anchor, however heavy. Its chained amusement to bore the mark of contradiction. Music and dance softened hearts. Theaters reflected truth. But bear-baiting pits roared with cruelty. Cockfights spattered blood, and hangings drew crowds as fairs did. Laughter mingled with screams, cheer with death. For in Tudor England, the line between joy and horror was thin, fragile, easily crossed. Society was a ladder none could climb with ease. Nobles feasted, merchants bargained, yeomen tilled, laborers sweated, beggars starved. Each rung was bound by birth, each life tethered. By fate, a king might fall to the axe, a noble to disgrace, a peasant to hunger, but few ever rose higher than their fathers. Fortune was a wheel, turning without mercy, lifting some, crushing many, and within it all lived the nameless multitude. The plowman, bent and weary, sowed seed so others might eat. The widow spun wool by candlelight, her children clinging to warmth of song. The apprentice, blistered and weary, dreamed of mastery. The maidservant scrubbed until her hands split, unseen but essential. The beggar clutched his bowl, despised yet enduring. Their names are gone, but their lives were the true pillars of England, to step into their world. Even for a day would be to meet hardship at every turn. Smoke would sting the eyes, hunger gnaw the belly, cold seep into bones. The stench of filth would choke, the fear of plague haunt, the threat of law loom. A food would be coarse, labor endless, rest uneasy. Laughter would come, but it would be brief, shadowed by sorrow. For those born outside their time, a single day would break body and spirit, yet for them it was life. They endured, and in their endurance lies the true greatness of Tudor England, not in crowns nor battles, but in survival itself. Their breath built the world, their labor fed it, their songs gave it voice. Kings sat upon thrones of velvet, but the throne itself stood upon the shoulders of the nameless. Now, centuries have passed. The gallows are empty, the plague pits grass-covered, the bear-baiting rings silent, the bridges washed clean of beggars' cries. Yet the stones of England still whisper. The fields once tilled still bear grain, the churches still toll bells. The roads still carry feet, and beneath them, in memory, in silence, the multitude endures. Tudor England is gone, but its truth remains. It was a world both bright and dark, radiant and cruel, holy and brutal. It was a world where survival was triumph, where laughter was rebellion, where life itself was precious because it was so fragile. And though we could not endure even a single day in their world, they endured lifetimes. Thus the story ends, not with kings nor queens, but with them the countless souls who lived unseen, who bore the weight of England in their bodies, who left no mark but their endurance. Their worth cannot be measured in coin or rank, but only in the truth that they lived, they suffered, they hoped, and they endured, and in that endurance lies eternity.